the Guyana economy and society have been evolving rapidly. So at times, it's important to step back before we simply launch in to figure out what, when, and why would be the best way to re-engage. So we mark this afternoon, or this afternoon marks the Green Institute's rebooting itself in a sense as we engage with the public. It's all well and good for us to do the private things like presentations, like discussions, like interviews. I myself have had quite a few of those. The last one being with BBC Hard Talk. It was actually incredible to sit there and see someone, you know, you only see in television. So yes, indeed, the Green Institute has been busy, but now it's time for us to re-engage with our community, a rapidly changing community, as you all know, in society. This afternoon among us are, in addition to your gracious selves, all of you who've taken the time out to be here, despite what must have been a busy schedule and a long day. We have among us the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, all the way to the left. That's Dr. Dianna DaSilva-Glasgow. Dr. Glasgow, Dianna, was a student of mine. And I remember so well that not only was she very bright and very organized, but she was fiercely independent. And there was one occasion at least when she sort of decided that she will defy her lecturer. Do you remember that, Dianna? Always a good sign. Today she is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I congratulate her publicly, and I'd like to thank her as well for being a part of this, playing a very important role in this afternoon's event, despite her being very busy. Also with us is Professor J. Mandle, who is a member of our advisory board, and who will be introduced by Dr. Glasgow, Dr. DaSilva-Glasgow. To the folks who are online, as well as yourselves, after Professor Mandle's presentation, there will be a question and answer time, and we would like those of you who are online to be fully engaged. We've really set this up nicely. I'd like to say thank you in particular to the Center for Communications Studies at the University of Guyana and Mr. Orfeo Griffith, as well as the Learning Resource Center for having made this possible. So thank you all, I bid you welcome, and the floor is yours, Dr. Glasgow.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon in this very important public lecture. Whenever you have scholarly stalwarts around, you must take full advantage of the intellectual agility, excuse me, that they bring, and you must, of course, facilitate as may be necessary. And so there are a number of very critical topical issues that we could examine, but this afternoon, Professor Mandle has chosen to discuss the issue of migration and migration shocks, which is a very, very important issue, because having discovered oil, we all expected that by now, Guyana might have had 2 million people, but unfortunately, we're still at about 760. So clearly, the migration issue is something that still warrants a lot of discussion in terms of how do we deal with the fact that over the last couple of decades, we've had a very significant hemorrhaging of our intellectual resources, and we're now at a pinnacle where those resources are significantly needed. So the person who is going to speak to you this evening, you know him by name, J. Mandle, but there's a lot to be said about him. He's currently the W. Bradford Wiley Professor of Economics at Colgate University. He's widely published. He has studied in the field of economics at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Michigan. He has taught at the University of, at the Temple University, the University of the West Indies, Nankai University in the People's Republic of China, the University of California, Berkeley, Lincoln University, and our very own University of Guyana. While he has studied economics broadly as a discipline, he has specialized in the areas of economic theory and economic development. And in terms of applied research work, he has a very strong interest in Caribbean economic development, African American economic history, contemporary United States economy, sports in society, and the Occupy Wall Street movement. He's also a proud member of the University of Guyana Greed Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the podium Professor J. Mandle.
Well, thank you for that very flattering introduction. I have a very strong memory of this room. In 2016, my wife Joan and I were doing a series of lectures, and we now talk about that experience in the following terms. It didn't matter what our subject was. Remember, this was 2016. The second question that we received invariably was, will Donald Trump win? And our answer invariably was, not a chance. It is now 2024. I expect when this lecture is over, that question will be repeated. My answer will be the same. My anticipation is that our prognostication will be more accurate this time than last time, please God. Second introductory remark I want to make is academics like myself need an opportunity to germinate ideas. We need an environment which it allows for creativity to be expressed. And I have to say that in my own case, the University of Guyana Green Institute has served my interests very well. It speaks to what we call, within the realms of the UGGI, the dilemma that how can a country both be a petroleum producer and yet contribute to the creation of a sustainable earth? And Thomas Singh provides an environment and an atmosphere which I can say personally has been extremely stimulative to my own thinking. And in the paper that I will be delivering today, it's directly attributable to that environment. It provides a context in which creative thinking can be accomplished. And Thomas, I thank you. Guyana has united in facing down Venezuela's threat to its territorial integrity. That's an accomplishment. But even as it has done so, the people of the country have yet to sufficiently confront the reality that two of what I call demographic shocks may cause conflicts between Guyana's citizens and newly arrived immigrants. So the overall context in which this paper is presented is the following. The first of these shocks will result in the uprooting of much of the country's coastal population, the result of flooding caused by global climate change. Large numbers of Guyanese will become climate migrants. The second shock will be an extensive inflow of international migrants, a consequence of Guyana's having become a major petroleum exporter. The threat of discord will emerge if both internal and international migrants seek to resettle away from the coast in locations that lack the capacity to accommodate the numbers that are involved. That's the overall context of the discussion that will ensue. At present, you all know, an elaborate water control system has allowed almost all of the Guyanese population to reside on the Atlantic coast. Though the coastal plain is below sea level, the protection provided by the seawall and cokers controlling flows from the interior has made settlement viable. However, as global warming intensifies, this protective arrangement is increasing jeopardy. A study of Guyana's water control system carried out by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, in 2011 concluded, and I'm quoting from the story, the adaptation assets that are currently in place only represent an upgrading of engineering won by the Dutch in the 17th and 18th centuries. As ECLAC put it, even with adaptation, the vulnerability of the Guyanese economy to climate change is increased each year. More recently, Guyana's own second national communication to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change updated and confirmed that assessment. It reported that the country's coastal zone is, quote, exposed to storm surges caused by extreme weather events, and this phenomenon can be exacerbated by the impending sea level rise. It goes on, this combination, not only would human settlements, infrastructure, and persons be at risk to coastal inundation, but also valuable ecosystems and the East Demerara Water Conservancy, agricultural lands and crops and aquaculture activities, which are the most significant economic sectors, will be threatened. This is a recent publication by the government. This document, as these vast climate change threats will very likely create hardships for the economy and livelihoods of the people of Guyana, leading to health and food insecurity, migrations, and a decrease in the main sources of income such as tourism, wood, fisheries, agricultural exports. The country's capital city, Georgetown, is particularly vulnerable. In 2023, the news website called Time Out used maps created by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to show the parts of the world that could find themselves threatened by rising sea levels. Time Out identified 15 cities that, quote, would find themselves entirely or in large part underwater within a decade. Number 8 on the list was Georgetown. What this suggests is that Guyana's future Guyana's future dislocations will include the country's administrative, political, and judicial institutions now located in the capital city. In addition to the shock of population displacement associated with climate change, Guyana will also have to contend with a second demographic shock, a substantial inflow of international migrants. This migration will be the consequence of Guyana's becoming a major petroleum exporter and of the small size of the country's labor force. According to the Migration Policy Institute, quote, even if the country were to harness all unemployed, underemployed, and discouraged Guyanese workers, the domestic supply of that form of labor would amount to only 63,500 workers. The problem is that according to this same source, the country will need to attract a minimum of 100,000 workers to reach its full potential, noting that this is particularly the case given Guyana's loss of most of its skilled workforce during the many years it experienced high levels of emigration. Immigrants to Guyana can be expected to include two distinctly different groups. One will be trained engineers and technicians who migrate to take the skilled positions that the petroleum industry is unable to fill locally. This issue, the petroleum industry's role in attracting skilled labor to Guyana, was studied by the International Labor Organization. They did a survey, and among the 29 firms surveyed, the ILO found what it called, quote, a pronounced gap between the industry's labor demand and the availability of skilled workers at the local level. The problem these firms experienced was that only about half of the skills highlighted as most important were considered widely available in Guyana. Importantly, in this regard, the ILO reported that the needed technical skills, quote, were considered scarce in the country, though generally available abroad. The second inflow of people to Guyana will be those who are less well-trained than the technicians and engineers that are coming to the country. Though this inflow has not yet been extensively studied, it is likely that many, if not most, low-income immigrants will come from neighboring Venezuela. A regional refugee and migrant response plan produced by the United Nations Refugee Agency estimates that by 2023, there were already 23,700 Venezuelans immigrants resident in Guyana, with that number expected to increase in future years. Most Venezuelans enter Guyana by sea or river and remain concentrated in interior locations such as Port Kaituma, Maruma, and Bartica. Many of the Venezuelans in Guyana have arrived without work permits. In a government listing of 4,739 individuals who had been granted work permits between September 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2023, only 122 came from Venezuela. With that being the case, the UN agency that prepared this document noted that Venezuelan immigrants, quote, face several challenges in accessing food, shelter, and health services. It goes on, quote, a lack of safe and dignified shelter has been a burden for the Venezuelan population. The risk that arises stems from the fact that at the same time that many Guyanese will be forced to relocate from the coast, numerous newcomers will be arriving in the country. It's not hard to foresee that unless careful planning is undertaken ahead of time, these groups will be forced to compete for settlement space and housing. In that competition resides the threat of conflict, particularly if the relatively affluent engineers and technicians that come to the country are accorded a privileged access to new residencies compared to the Guyanese climate migrants from the coast. The question that arises is what, if anything, can Guyana do to minimize the threat of such intergroup conflict and tensions? Two strategies suggest themselves. The first would be adaptation, for the government to strengthen the system of sea defenses. If that were accomplished, it would be possible to reduce the number of displaced coastal residents and in so doing minimize the competition between the immigrants and Guyanese. The second strategy would be for the government to construct relatively inexpensive houses away from the coastal plain. This too could act to reduce the likelihood of conflict between Guyana's climate migrants and immigrants from abroad. Two different alternative approaches. With regard to the first, strengthening sea protection, an extensive engineering literature has appeared in the last 20 years showing how this might be accomplished. At the heart of the matter is the fact that the seawall Guyana has depended upon to protect the coast has in fact impeded the natural process of coastal expansion and defense, the natural process of coastal defense. According to this literature, a perverse, quote, insidious shift from mangroves to seawalls has meant that coastal protection has been less efficient than otherwise would have been the case. Am I hearing an echo? This relatively new perspective emerged when it was realized that if unimpeded, mud banks originating in the Amazon River can facilitate the growth of mangrove forests. According to Edward J. Anthony and his associates, hard coastal defense structures, such as Guyana's seawall and riprap, produce a, quote, progressive breakdown in the mud bank and associated mangrove system. They have reduced a mangrove belt that covered the entire Guyanese coastline in the 18th century. Failing to change the centuries-old use of seawall protection, they write, quote, will result in large-scale erosion that can only be countered by further engineering structures at prohibitive costs. Building on these insights, the Dutch research and consulting firm, Deltaris, in collaboration with Conservation International, produced a 2022 study entitled Guyana Mangrove Seawall Engineering Guidance. The study is composed of two parts. In the first, it offers guidelines for, quote, the assessment, development, and implementation of green-gray solutions along Guyana's coast. Included are recommendations for interventions such as setbacks for the existing seawalls and the installation of sediment capturing equipment that would extend the mud bank's recolonization of mangroves. The second part is a more technical document that provides the scientific background for the study's recommendations. The overall conclusion that emerges from the document is that, quote, decisions made at this juncture will reverberate for generations of Guyanese citizens. And it goes on. Luckily, Guyana is still in a position to put nature to work alongside national development by employing preemptive, innovative, and scalable solutions that reclaim from the sea what has been lost. There is evidence of the government's interest in this non-traditional means to protect the coast. In December of 2023, at the opening of Guyana's first Mangrove Information and Preservation Center at Mont Repos, there the Minister of Agriculture, Mustafa, reported that the government had spent $200 million to restore mangroves on the Essequibo coast and at Mahakoni, describing these projects as, quote, part of Guyana's adaptation of the green-gray infrastructure approach to the protection and resilience of our coastline. Specifically, he mentioned the use of sediment trapping units and the use of geotextile tubes to form groins and breakwaters, illustrations of the government's commitment to innovation and sustainable solution to sea defense. Notwithstanding the government's interest in adopting new methods of coastal protection, however, it is doubtful that, as currently envisioned, what it is seeking to accomplish is doubtful that it's sufficient to provide the needed rehabilitation of mangrove protection. Guyana's coast extends for almost 300 miles, dwarfing the green-gray government projects. Thus, while the opening of the Mangrove Center is an event to be welcomed, its positive impact is not likely to be large enough to protect much of the coast from destructive levels of flooding. So that leads me to the second strategy, second possible response by the government to the threat of conflict between immigrants and domestic migrants. And it's one that has been long discussed in Guyana, the opening of the interior for population resettlement. The interior is a vast territory, occupying 85% of Guyana's 83,000 square miles. But its capacity to accommodate new arrivals is constrained by at least two intractable obstacles. First, there is the importance of respecting the interests of the Amerindian population that resides in numerous locations in the interior. For simple justice to prevail, their land should not be made available for resettlement unless agreed to by this population. Second, the forest is a vast carbon sink. Clearing large swaths of the forest to accommodate new residents would put in jeopardy Guyana's own low-carbon development strategy, which primarily involves protecting the rainforest. The National Land Use Plan, developed in 2013, is the most recent government study of the potential for interior settlement. It reports that, I'm quoting, having taken into account national infrastructure development and identified 4 hotspots in the interior, locations that quote, have potential for a number of land uses and can be linked to each other and already existing developed areas by improving infrastructure linkages. The hotspots that the land use study identified were Matthews Ridge, Port Katuma, Bartica Linden, the intermediate savanna, and the northern Rupununi savanna. The difficulty here is that none of these inland locations appear able to absorb a large enough number of migrants in the foreseeable future. Each has specific drawbacks. Though Matthew Ridge is described as an area that could be earmarked as an urban center if people were forced to move away from the coastal plain, it adds, quote, the current lack of access, power, and the cost of developing access to the area is likely to remain a major constraint for some time to come. Second, the plan describes the northern Rupununi as lacking, quote, particularly good agricultural land and is therefore only suitable for large-scale farming. The third, the intermediate savanna in the south of the country is described as possessing potential for agriculture, livestock, and plantation forestry or biofuels coupled with an expansion of bauxite mining, but according to the study, its development will require linkages with processing centers such as Linden and export ports such as New Amsterdam. That leaves Bartica Linden, with the report includes largely to its position as a center linking areas of production transport links and particularly to coastal ports, but Bartica as a location for development is problematic. It is situated on the banks of the Essequibo and is therefore subject to flooding, a problem that will only grow worse as the effects of climate change are experienced. In short, even the areas projected in the land use plan as potential locations are unlikely to solve Guyana's future migration problems. Now, it is important to note that in 2013, the then Minister of Housing, Mohammed Irfan Ali, offered a plan that seemed to bypass these interior difficulties. He argued then that, quote, from a planning perspective, it is becoming increasingly more difficult for us to find plots of land on the East Coast. But instead of advocating interior settlement, he explained that Guyana could create a new city that would be, quote, a viable mid-town, midpoint area and a development opportunity for Guyanese people. To that end, he announced then that the government had begun discussions concerning a new urban place to be located on the sandy soils of the Linden-Sasdak Highway. After a period of neglect, in 2022, Ali, now president of Guyana, renewed the discussion of a new city that he called Silica City. He repeated his earlier argument that there was a need for a, quote, secondary city because we are already seeing the pressure on Georgetown and the country must be prepared for it. As explained by Colin Kroll, Minister of Housing and Water, the need for Silica City, quote, is primarily born out of the need for Guyana to have an urban center that is complementary to the existing city, Georgetown. The need to respond to climate change was also advanced as a justification for Silica City. In a November 2021 press conference, Finance Minister Ashni Singh discussed the fact that the country's low-lying coastal plain was increasingly threatened by rising sea levels and flooding, and that, quote, encouraging more inland development is part of the government's efforts to counter the threat. The population size of the city that President Ali envisioned, 50,000, however, is far short of what will be become the country's resettlement needs. The population currently resident on the coast is at least 600,000. If only 50% of that number were forced to relocate, Silica City would be able to absorb less than 20% of the migrants, of the domestic migrants. That capacity shortfall will be even greater when international migrants seeking accommodation are included. The government has contracted with a newly created University of Miami Guyana Innovation Group to develop a master plan for the new city. A presentation to potential investors from Saudi Arabia revealed that not only would the new city include a residential zone, a tourism district, a conservation district, an agricultural zone, a hydroponic area, and an administrative and sports district. As the columnist Pete Diao explained, quote, "The new city is not meant to replace Georgetown as the capital. Silica City would be creating an urban center supplanting Georgetown and the meeting of environmental criteria that Georgetown finds it so difficult to achieve." But not only is the new city too small, it is also clear that it is not designed to accommodate low-income individuals. And low-income individuals will disproportionately be numbered among the former coastal residents. At the public consultation in March 2023, the minister in the Ministry of House and Water, Susan Rodriguez, reported that, quote, "This will be slightly different from the ones that were constructed on the East Bank. As she put it, Silica City will have beautifully aesthetic building designs and most of all the creation of a modern new smart city that will create the nurturing of lifestyles that balance culture, climate change risks, and economic vitality." At a public discussion held concerning Silica City, Rodriguez reported that the first phase of development would, quote, "involve the construction of high-end professional homes, and that these two-story houses will be on the periphery of an 18-hole international golf course that is expected to attract persons to the area." Silica City's inadequacies with respect to size and its bias to wealth reflect that insufficient attention has been paid to Guyana's forthcoming resettlement problems. It has not sufficiently addressed the demographic composition of the people who will be on the move. Now, the reasons for that complacency are understandable. Today, the number of international immigrants arriving in the country remains at relatively low levels, and the coast remains a viable residential location for most Guyanese. Thus, there does not seem to be an immediate pressing reason for policymakers and the public to prepare for the worst. But the fact is that the scale of the problems that face the country in the future does require present-day attention. Now is the time to start seriously thinking about the planning for the creation of new population centers that will be able to attract a whole range of people who will be displaced from the coast and who will be coming to the country from abroad. Guyana is a country with petroleum, and with the petroleum, the country possesses the funds to undertake this kind of project. The question is, will the country, its leadership, and its population sufficiently anticipate what is going to happen in the future, make its preparations for that future now, and allocate the funds which will be available to implement a strategy that will allow the country to avoid the conflict of competing immigrants that I fear will occur in the absence of such planning. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to this Q&A because I do not pretend to have all the answers on this question. Thanks very much.
All right, we must certainly thank Professor Mandle for a very intriguing presentation. I hope you have your questions all lined up. He raised a number of issues. He identified some shocks in terms of migratory flows to Guyana. He pointed to the uproot of the country's coastal populations, extensive inflows of international migrants, among other shocks, and he also spoke to the impact the petroleum industry would have in attracting labor to Guyana and potential intergroup conflicts that could arise with the influx of Venezuelan immigrants, that are coming to Guyana. So we're going to open the floor to questions, comments. For those persons who are joining us online, there are two options. You can drop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll afford you the opportunity to ask your question. And of course, for those persons who are here in person, please feel free to raise your hand if there are questions or comments that you may have for Professor Mandle. So the floor is now open. Who's going to take the first shot? Do we have another mic? Art, I'll come to you.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum and namaskar. I think this is the third time I've met Dr. Mandle here, right in this room and across in one of the buildings that way, some years ago. But I first read your work in 1977, 78 when I was a student at the University of Alberta in Canada, doing geology, but we had to do arts options, so I had to do anthropology, and all my lecturers actually in anthropology were Marxists, some from Guyana, the Thakur brothers, and so we had to read all of the Marxist books at the time, Barron and Sweezy, and Mandle, of course, and others. Right? We didn't have any rightist books at that time in Canada. Now, one of the things you talked about, the petrostate. Right now we are producing 650,000 barrels of oil per day. But by early 2028, according to ExxonMobil, we're going to increase that to 1.4 million barrels per day because 3 more FPSOs are coming in, each at 250,000 barrels a day. So once you reach a 1.4 million barrels a day, you're actually 1/10 of the current production of the United States of America, which has 340 million people, and we have less than 1 million here. So that should make a difference. I think maybe you can talk about that. This increase that we're going to see in another 4 years. And although we have a poor agreement with Exxon and friends, we're still raking in right now about 7 million US per day, and by then it should go up to about 16 million per day. And if the money is spent properly, we should see some progress here. You mentioned our president, the former minister of housing. and his visions at that time, 10, 11 years ago, for Silicon City and other places. And I suppose his massive infrastructural drive to get roads to these places, you know, and now he's shouting at some of the contractors because they're moving too slow, is part of, you know, what he would have talked about 10, 11 years ago. And you mentioned the problem with labor. I remember at a previous Green Institute conference when you were here, and I think there was Dr. Fraser and Dr. Prem Das, when it was stated at the time that only 2.3% of Guyanese living in Guyana had tertiary education. Now with the gold program, that probably has gone to 4%. That still leaves 96% of Guyanese living in Guyana with only a maximum of secondary education, maybe 50% with only primary education, of which 20% have no education. And a petrostate cannot be sustained on 96% secondary education. So obviously there has to be a massive influx of tertiary people. And we're seeing them, mainly from the oil companies. You go to Giffland Mall, they're there, you see them. I meet Routledge there probably every week. He shops at Food Max. You know, he tells me all nice things anytime I meet him at Giffland. But maybe you may have another perspective on what the Exxon people are telling us. Thanks.
I mean, you said that better than I did. An earlier version of this paper elicited the comment that I was taking an anti-immigrant view. It was inadvertent. I didn't mean to do that, and I took it out of the paper. I do not adopt a position of hostility to immigrants, especially in this context in which there's an obvious market need for immigrants with regard to the technical skills that are required not just by the industry itself, but by the service sectors that provide services to petroleum. And I have no hostility to relatively low-income people who flee a place like Venezuela in search of a better standard of living that they envision they could accomplish in Guyana by securing employment opportunities that are created by virtue of the industry. So I don't mean to and don't intend and hope I am not interpreted as meaning that the inflow should be curbed. This is an opportunity, and the thrust of my paper is to say the country has to consider how it is that they can accommodate, how it can accommodate the inflow that would be beneficial both to the country and to those who are migrating here.
All right, so we have two questions online. The first is coming from a Miss Nicole Cole. She says, Professor, have you looked at the ethnic insecurity or racism that has been a huge problem here in Guyana amongst Guyanese when international migrants are added to the social fabric of Guyana? What will this mean for people of African descent whose very existence are consistently threatened by inherent systemic bias?
Of course. I knew that. I know that. I know that a society that is experiencing, continues to experience tensions with respect to ethnicity, such a society is always at risk. I deliberately did not mention that in this paper. I wanted to identify a different source of potential conflict in the country, which would be overlay upon the already existing tensions. I think the problem of the already existing tensions will manifest themselves even more when this migration gets underway. But I wanted to not cloud the analysis. I wanted to identify clearly here is a new source of tension that the society will experience. But of course, that's obviously a relevant issue. And I only say that I omitted it because for purposes of clarity, I wanted to focus on this new source of tension.
All right, so there's another question online. Professor Mandle has made the case for building a new urban center. Government seems to have already bought into this plan. How to get moving on this plan? I think it's a bit of a rhetorical question because the person indicates we should start laying out land, allocating money, etc. So let me just go to the next question and then perhaps you can respond to both. There's another question from a Teresa Tullock. It says, on climate change, do you consider serious defense breaches of the seawall and mangroves on the East Coast before 2050? I'm not sure if it's your area of expertise, but it's up to you if you'd want to weigh in on this issue. So those are the 2 points online, and of course, persons who are here, feel free to also ask questions. I'll allow Professor Mandle to respond to those 2, and then we'll move to the next set of questions.
Well, I mean, all societies have great difficulty in envisioning that the future is going to be different than the present. And this is particularly the case because the science is clear. It is unambiguous that the storms will intensify, the sea will rise, but it's all at this point theory, very sound theory, but it is not experienced in the present. People don't see that. I mean, 2005, after all, was a massive flood, but it's almost 20 years ago, and there's a whole cohort of population that has no personal experience with that. And so I understand, and I think it's significant that it is hard for a population to come to terms with an imminent threat, especially in light of the fact that as good as the science is, and it's very good, no scientist, no observer can say, as of this specific date, this is going to happen. And since it hasn't really happened for 20 years or so, the population and its political leaders put it aside as something that is not of imminent importance. And of course, the role of an outsider, I am not Guyanese, no matter my affections for the country, the role of an outsider like myself is to be able to say things that do not get normally said in the conversations in the country. I can see and have a privileged position to be able to talk about things that on one hand the population doesn't really do, and politicians do not therefore see the need to talk about because they're not being pressed by the population. My job as an outsider is to put up a mirror so people can see what otherwise they are not likely to see. And, I mean, and as I say, that is what Thomas Singh provides me with the opportunity, the incentive to produce that kind of outcome.
All right, I'm seeing 2 hands raised online. Joseph Singh, could we allow him to ask his questions, please, or a few? And Abdullah Aswat, I'm not sure if you still have a question. I notice you lowered your hand, but if you do, I'll allow you to speak. Just let me allow the two persons online because I think they had their hands up a while. And then you'll go, right? So Joseph Singh, go ahead, please.
Thank you, moderator. Good evening, everyone. Professor Mandle, are you hearing me? Are you hearing me? I'm sorry, I'm not. Hello? Sorry, I'm not hearing you. Please move on.
We're hearing you.
I'll send it through chat. I'll send my question through chat.
Noted. All right, please go to the chat instead. All right, so there's another question in the chat, but let me allow this student to go first, and then I'll come back to this question in the chat. And Mr. Singh, Mr. Aswat, I apologize that you're not hearing us clearly, but please do use the chat feature to ask your questions. Go ahead, please.
Sure, thank you. Now, Guyanese have long migrated to other parts of the world, including Venezuela. Now, we have started to see an influx of Venezuelans in Guyana. Do you think, or don't you think that the Venezuelans being allowed to relocate to Guyana can be seen as a kind gesture in keeping with the human rights laws? And what measures do you think can be put in place to better monitor the influx of Venezuelans in Guyana? Do you think a boundary should be put? Do you think only those who lived here should come back? Or what measures do you think can be put in place?
As you know, I'm not a military expert. I will say what I'm going to say with more uncertainty and less conviction than I normally bring to the table. However, since you asked me, I tentatively would say what I said in the very beginning of this presentation. I don't know if you heard that first sentence, but I put it there purposefully. I won't repeat it, but I will give you the gist of it. I think the threat was real. I think that the Guyanese population unified in opposition to that threat. I think the region mobilized effectively in support of the country. I don't think the threat is over, but I think that the combination of especially regional supporters and to some extent the United States mobilized effectively enough so that the threat, though real, was not operationalized. I anticipate that that mobilization will be able to be sustained in the future, and as a result, the territorial integrity of the country will be retained. I say that all tentatively. As I say, I'm not an expert, but I thought the outcome was beneficial to the country. And of course, I have to say that in a world in which conflict seems to be spreading all over and violence and death and destruction is the way of life, that this particular conflict was resolved without such violence is a triumph.
All right, thank you.
I have another
Could we allow the persons online to now speak? All right, so Joseph Singh, could you go ahead with your question, please, or your comment?
Are you hearing me now, moderator?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Mandle, always a pleasure to listen to your presentation. This one is, again, very informative. I just want to have some comments and then a question. In terms of your climate migrants, I think you're aware that there is satellite monitoring of the mud banks, and we're using that information to determine where it is possible to not only allow for the regrowth of mangroves, but also interventions using the geotechnic tubes to help in sedimentation and raising the elevation, which will allow mangroves to thrive. And it is not confined to only the area that Minister Mustafa referred to. We are doing this along the entire coastline. Not that that is likely to solve the problem, because rising sea levels will also penetrate up the rivers. So we also have to be concerned about people living and economic activity along the banks of rivers. The second point I'd like to make is that the number of persons who came over here from Venezuela, many of them are returning Guyanese. Many are descendants of Guyanese who migrated to Venezuela and who are absorbed, generally speaking, by their family groups. Those persons who are from Delta Amacura, many of them are Waraos, who don't really differentiate between Venezuela and Guyana. In other words, the border for them is not a barrier. And they are living in places like the Barima and border communities such as Yarakita and so on. So we have to categorize the migrants into indigenous Waraos, or persons who are Spanish and who tend to come further in the coast, along the coast, like in Region 3 and Region 4 and elsewhere, because they have skills which make them available in the construction industry and so on. Again, we also have to recognize that internal changes in Venezuela, hopefully, with superpower involvement like the US, the Venezuelan elections are due, I think, the last week in July. And the US is also looking at whether they should reintroduce sanctions to ensure that the opposition participates in a democratic process. So I hope that internal changes in Venezuela will also reduce the urge for persons to want to migrate to Guyana. This, of course, depends very much on what transpires in the upcoming elections. The last point I want to make is that there are areas in the Bartica Triangle which is high ground, meaning that not all of Bartica is low level. There's a ridge which runs all the way towards Isano, another one going towards Kanguruma. The potential is there. In fact, there was a study done by the Ministry of Natural Resources in conjunction with a German firm many moons ago, and that study is available at the Ministry of Natural Resources for a huge area identified. I don't know if you remember Bentowella, and our then director or commissioner, as he was then, of Lands and Surveys, Andrew Bishop. They jointly authored a study which was done of the Bartica Triangle and identified that as a possible project area for substantial settlement. The intermediate savannas also along the Linden, Kakwani, Aichuni alignment. And I take your point about the North Rupununi because it's also an area of high biodiversity. And we need therefore to be very conscious of all of these factors when discussing your very important points that you made in your presentation. So thank you very much. Those were just my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. All right, so we had a very loaded submission there. Do you want to respond to anything?
Those were three very important points that I want to underline. One, the discussion, my discussion, assumed no change in Venezuela, and that assumption might be erroneous, but it's the operating assumption that Guyana should experience, should incorporate, because it is a worst case scenario where if the current regime in Venezuela prevails and persists, then another point that was made, that at the moment, many of the migrants from Venezuela are Guyanese, is accurate, but is not likely to persist. It is likely that if circumstances in Venezuela do not change, the composition of the migration will become increasingly Venezuelan. And that then raises this question that I noted, that the United Nations study of the circumstances that involve the Venezuelans coming from Venezuela, they experience considerable hardship, which the country, Guyana, will be forced to confront, because they will not, Guyana will not want to have a growing large population of Venezuelans who suffer real deprivation. So the composition of the flow from Venezuela in large part depends on circumstances that exist in Venezuela, and it is a kind of optimistic and almost heroic assumption to think that in some kind of reasonable time things will get better in Venezuela. I would say policy making should not make that optimistic assumption. The question of Bartica as the location for resettlement is accurate. There is the possibility of more settlement than I gave credence to in my presentation. Part of this is, I confess, autobiographical, because when I gave a presentation like this at Moray House in 2016, I was myself excessively optimistic about the potential for resettlement in the interior. I neglected to talk about the obstacles to settlement, and then particularly I emphasized in this presentation respecting the interests of the Amerindian population and respecting the need to protect the rainforest. And so it's possible that, I think it's true that in painting this difficulty, I may have overlooked some of the possibilities, and so some of that was simply me trying to correct the errors that I had made several years ago. But it just in general, to talk about resettlement in the interior raises difficult questions of specific locations and how is it going to be done.
All right, so there's a question here from Lynn J. Harry, Voglizon. She says, I think we'll also have to consider the possible impact of Guyanese immigration from the diaspora, as well as the domestic birth rate. What is a possible prognosis from your perspective?
Part of the migration from the diaspora will be to fill those high-tech engineering positions that are going to be open. And so Silica City, to some extent, looks like it is to provide housing for that particular population well-educated, relatively high income, and that will be largely, not largely, to some extent composed of people from the diaspora. My worry is that not enough accommodation is being provided for the less skilled people coming into the country, and frankly, the farmers who are going to be relocated from the interior. They are not going to need 18-hole golf courses. They are going to need housing that is consistent with their income status and occupations. And my worry, therefore, is in talking about the inflow, the composition, the segmentation of that population, the inflow, only the top side in terms of income status is being consistently thought about when something like Silica City is being considered.
All right, dear. Sorry, we had two persons who had their hands raised, Abdullah Aswat and Blas Regnault. If we could allow them, please, and then I'll come back to you. So could we allow Abdullah to speak, please?
Hi. Thank you
Go
very
ahead,
much. Hi, can you hear me okay? Oh, sorry. Hi. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask this question. Thank you, Professor, for the informative talk. I actually wanted to ask you whether you would agree with me in that what Guyana is experiencing at the moment in terms of the windfall that the economy is receiving from hydrocarbons, in addition to the social problems that you've also highlighted, so the positives and the benefits from hydrocarbon windfall. Would you agree with me in my opinion that we should look into economic history potentially and look at the experience of other countries, other hydrocarbon-rich economies, for example, Qatar, which experience very similar things, very small population, and starting possibly even from a lower base than even Guyana is. Yes, so the question is, do you think that it would be worthwhile project to actually consider those experiences and potentially reflect on how policymakers proceed in the case of Guyana? Thank you.
Abdullah, I'm sorry, could you just repeat your question, please? We missed a portion of what you said.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry about that. I wanted to ask you, should we look at the experience of other hydrocarbon-rich economies in terms of how they have actually used this windfall for their development and how they've addressed the problems, including migration, that's been associated with the sudden increase in hydrocarbon wealth? Would that be a worthwhile project for a policymaker in Guyana today?
Yeah, I think I got it. I think I have the question. Proponents, no, let me start again. Economists like myself habitually think of migration as a desirable activity. It provides employment for people in the location to which they go. They enhance the productive capacity of the place to which they go. They reduce population pressures in the region from which they came. In economic theory, migration is a positive event both for the region of exit and the region of attraction. We, in the profession, have been exceptionally naive with regard to the potential conflicts that emerge. And in the era of globalization, when migration of capital has increased and the migration of labor has increased, we have seen that the economist's naivete with respect to the downside of migration has come to manifest itself. And no other country in the world shows this more than the country that benefited most from migration, namely the United States of America. And we now are living with a political figure who shall go unnamed, who now is thriving because of the inattention of that society to those conflicts which have not been sufficiently addressed by, for example, the economics profession. So yes, the answer to that particular question, if I understand it correctly, and even if I don't, this is the answer I want to give, is yes, the experience of other countries should be examined closely and carefully with regard to the potential conflicts as well as the benefits that reside from emigration and migration, so that the benefits are not offset by the disaster of intercommunal conflict. And intercommunal conflict is a disaster.
All right, so we also have Mr. Regnault with his hand raised, and I notice he has a comment in the chat. Mr. Regnault, if you're willing to speak, you can open your mic and either ask a question or make the comment that you've placed in the chat.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Yes. Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. It's nice to see you again. I like your presentation. But I have two comments. The first one is we have to be careful with this idea of migration from Venezuela, because migrants usually go to Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and Ecuador, etc., even the US, Mexico. And it is already a given fact. I mean, it is estimated between 5 and 7 million of during the last 7 years, or they migrated now from Venezuela. The thing is, maybe it's possible that Guyana is not the first potential destination from Venezuelans. So this is my main comment about, because it's also, there's a geographical condition there. That's why I understand very good when the colleague talk about the Waraos. It's a population that I know very well. This is in Delta Macuro, and it's true. They don't differentiate between, they don't distinguish between Guyana and Venezuela. This is my first comment. The second comment, I like your presentation because shows exactly the complexity where Guyana is going through. And in a way to respond also the question of the colleague talking about Qatar and so on, don't forget Qatar is a kingdom. It's not a republic. And this is the main situation with Guyana, which is interesting and important, as Venezuela is a king. Venezuela is a republic, which is completely different. This discussion in Qatar is impossible to have it. The discussion that we are now discussing, what we are now discussing now. And the second thing I think it's important to orientate the migration. I remember during the 50s in Venezuela, we ask, uh, we invite we invited people coming from Yugoslavia, Italy, Spain too, and then we were the actually my name is French because my family migrated to Venezuela, so migrated to Venezuela. So um, is so, in my opinion, the situation in Guyana nowadays is maybe an opportunity to development, to get a good and interesting development. But don't forget, we are talking about rents, and this is my point now. Again, the rent is really important to account the rent. I insist on this because otherwise the risk to miss this opportunity is super high. So if you can isolate the rent in accounting terms and later to invest and discuss about this is, in my opinion, the way. Well, thank you again, Jay, and I enjoyed. I hope to talk with you soon again. Thank you.
I thank you. All right, so this lovely lady in front here has a question. Sorry, this lady here, do you want to go ahead, please?
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Professor Mandle. I think the first caller covered what I was going to say. That is that we shouldn't view migration as a threat. We should see it as a positive, like Professor said. But we need a more structured approach, because if we're going to have the older people coming in, it means that our social service system will be taxed. Yes? That's one thing. And another thing we have to remember is that when the St. Lucians had the problem with Soufriere, there was a community developed in, I think, Linden, where they were settled. Yes, so I think the idea by Mr. Joseph Singh in settling them at Bartica, which is a point between Georgetown and Venezuela, a midway point, it will help them to more or less be integrated into the system and for them to know exactly what professions they held in Venezuela, and to have the authorities give them some background information, because we don't want to be importing criminals to, again, tax our society. I mean, changing the whole modus of the way we live. Yeah, we already have a high incidence of violence, but we don't want migrants to add to this problem. And I don't remember the other question.
Those are two excellent points. On one hand, yes, especially people coming from the coastal plain and the low-income people who will be coming to Guyana, a substantial fraction of that population will require social services. Absolutely true. Secondly, and for almost all of the migrants who are coming to the country, the match between their skills and the available employment opportunities will require the construction of institutions that facilitate the connection between the population and the employment opportunities. But what I want to say about that is Guyana no longer will be a poor country. Until 2020, it was all right for a government, I'm not doing parties right now, a government to say, we are a poor, underdeveloped country, our per capita GDP is low, we're as poor as Haiti, and claim poverty as the reason for the inadequacy of social services and the inadequacy of such programs as I am describing, in which the match between employment talents and skills and employment opportunities are brought together. This country will have the revenue and wealth to provide adequate social services and to provide the institutions that facilitate an efficient labor market. Poverty no longer will be the question as it exists in the country. The question will be whether as these circumstances, the migration occurs, will there be sufficient thought ahead of time, which of course is the purpose of this presentation, so that when it occurs, when the migration occurs, the wealth of the country will be used to facilitate a process that reduces, I don't say eliminate, reduces the likelihood of conflict when the migration occurs. So, I mean, there's a lot that has to be done in order for the migration not to cause conflict, but the country's wealth will no longer be the reason if that doesn't occur.
Go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Hello? Hello? Okay, yes, good evening, everyone. Professor Mandle, it was an excellent presentation. I think it gives everyone a lot of food for thought. As you hear from my accent, I'm not Guyanese, so like yourself, I have a different perspective of what's happening in the country. I think the tensions that you mentioned and the possible conflicts are more likely to be between the migrants who have command of considerable resources and the Guyanese who may be excluded from access to these resources. I take the point about the Venezuelans and other refugees or other economic migrants seeking to build their fortunes here, but I really think the challenge is how do you redistribute the wealth, as you just mentioned? How do you ensure that the Guyanese are included in the development process, and how they access and manage their own resources? And one of the things I haven't mentioned, or I haven't heard mentioned, is the importance of financial sector development in ensuring that resources flow to the nationals of Guyana, and to ensure that those who want to invest in the economy have that access. And also I think, and this is another point, we need to deal frontally, and I say we because it's CARICOM. We need to deal frontally with the problems of poverty in the region and underdevelopment in all its dimensions. So Guyana has to see itself as well as being a leader for the transformation of the Caribbean and the regional economy. And I think they cannot exclude themselves from that very huge responsibility. So I like what I've heard. The issue of resettlement and housing, it's very challenging. I think it's more challenging because of the constraints you have indicated in terms of the available land space and land development. And I think the government has to implement a policy to limit the use of the coastal area in terms of high-level development like hotels, because it will cause more erosion. So there has to be a very deliberate policy on how you save the coast and how you redistribute and reallocate the resources in the country. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There were 3 questions online. I'm just going to read those, and I think you can give your final set of responses. The first is coming from Roger Vickerman. He says, can I widen the view and ask you whether you think Guyana has an opportunity to place itself as a wider regional hub for the whole region in the same way as places like Dubai have? would this add to the potential conflict or provide an opportunity to diversify the economy? Second is coming from Teresa Tulloch. She said nothing will change in Venezuela. More migrants will come here of Guyanese blood and non-Guyanese blood. Guyana is bound by the Quito process and UN refugee HR. These human rights. These migrants will compete and some will be integrated. Do you see a favorable balance in this integration with Guyanese? And the last is from Mike Prasad. All right, so this is more a comment, and I think you've responded to this one. This is about the establishment of cities and relocation of persons. So I'm not going to bother with this one, but could you respond to the first two, please?
I'm not sure I got all of that, but I'll pick up something that I want to pick up on also. Guyana is not the first Caribbean nation to be a petroleum producer. And there are very many lessons to be learned from Trinidad's relatively unsuccessful deployment of its wealth to sustain an economy that goes forward. Now, in this case, I am not talking about what economists talk about all the time, which is the resource curse, the fact that petroleum tends to crowd out everything else. A wealthy country measured by national income standards, not the population. A wealthy country such as Guyana will become has the resources to re-energize the process of Caribbean integration. The long history of efforts of economic development in the region started with Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winning St. Lucian economist. And when Arthur Lewis in 1950 talked about the industrialization of the West, what were called the West Indies in those days, when Arthur Lewis envisioned how the region could become an industrialized location in the world, he articulated as a necessary condition for that to be done was regional integration. He had no thought that the individual islands and nations would proceed by themselves. He did not believe that the scale that was possible for production in any one of the islands was sufficient so modern economic development could occur. Trinidad, only to a very limited extent, used its wealth in that regard. And it would not be to Guyana's detriment, it would not be to Guyana's detriment to use a considerable amount of this wealth which is coming to the country to provide the resources to facilitate a re-energizing of the Caribbean community and its integration. Wealth provides opportunity, and wealth, when used in a efficient way, can reduce conflict, can reduce tensions, and in this case, the case I'm citing, can promote nation building. The region going from Jamaica to Guyana and all the islands in between is culturally very homogeneous. To an outsider, it's very clear. An outsider like my wife Joan and myself, we see that there really is the ability to come together because of cultural similarities. What's lacking is conflict because there is not a pooling of resources. And so I leave on a note which is very different than the note upon which I started, but these questions lead to this kind of discussion. Can Guyana not only welcome immigrants to the country, and I want to answer to that to be yes, but can that same wealth be used to extend outside of the country to better bring together a Caribbean community? And I think that answer too can be yes, and will require a very serious examination of what should we be doing with this bonanza which the country has been experienced. And I want to raise the horizon. It should not be just do things as they have been done before. Wealth can be used to promote very beneficial outcomes, but it takes us to think deeply about what it is that we want to accomplish. So on one hand, my discussion is, the discussion today was concerned with people coming to the region. On the other hand, this last discussion that we've had is, can the wealth also be used to bring together the people of the Caribbean? And I think the answer to that is also yes.
All right, thank you, Professor Mandle. All right, I know I said those two were the last questions. We have 2 minutes before we wrap up. And I notice Ulrich Trotz has his hand up. Dr. Singh, should I allow him to speak quickly? So Mr. Trotz, if you can, for just 1 minute, we hope you're not taking us down a different road than the one we tried to wrap up on. If not, we'd allow you to just close us off in a minute or so. So could you allow him to speak, please?
Hello, Jay. Welcome to my country. Sorry I couldn't be there with you. Just two very quick comments. Joe Singh had mentioned the Rupununi and mentioned biodiversity. You mentioned Rupununi and mentioned mega farms. And just a word of caution that the biodiversity in the Rupununi depends on the hydrological cycle. And mega farms, basically, with that type of intervention, one has to be very careful not to upset that hydrological cycle and lose that biodiversity. And very quickly about Silica City. One of my concerns basically is the way we are using our sand deposits in Guyana. I would hope that, developing Silica City doesn't compromise the potential. Our sand is the best raw material for making pure silica for the solar industry. It's also excellent for glass, and particularly now with the worldwide pressure to get rid of plastics. Glass containers is very important. It has the potential to provide a sound industrial base for employment, etc. And finally, on Silica City, there has been some concern about the role that whole ecosystem plays in the replenishment of the aquifers that we depend on the coast. So as we move forward, we need to take these factors into consideration. Thanks for an excellent presentation.
I want to end with that. I started this discussion by saying that the University of Guyana Green Institute has provided a home for me to do thinking. And one of the best teachers within that home was Ulrich Trotz. Thank you, Ulrich.
All right, thank you, everybody. We've had a good night. Very intriguing discussions. I want to invite at this time the President of the University of Guyana Society to just close us off with a vote of thanks.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Professor Mandle for such a beautiful presentation. It was quite edifying. We learned a lot. We were able to navigate with our current situation in our country. We were able to also understand the intricacies of everything that is happening around us in terms of oil and the development, migration and everything. It was beautifully done. We are so grateful to you for spending this time with us. You must, of course, have a busy schedule, but you took time out to invest in this guest lecture with us to edify us. And as a student, as a club leader, I feel especially proud and special to be a part of something like this, to be in the presence of such rich knowledge. And on behalf of the department, lecturers, and everyone that is here, we want to say thank you for your contribution today.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. For those online, thank you for joining. Those of us who are here, we have some light refreshments at the back. Do enjoy and have a good evening.
Thank you.